Hey everyone, Professor Lamar here, and welcome to our Chapter 7 first video. Now, before we jump into any of the content from Chapter 7, I wanted to take some time to explain what the videos will look like for this chapter. You see, I'm actually going to do a little bit of a different thing for Chapter 7. What we're going to have are actually more videos to break down this content than what you saw for the Exam 1 review and also for Chapter 6. For both the Exam 1 review and Chapter 6, we had 3 videos, or sometimes 4, to really break down the content. But I'm going to try for Chapter 7 to keep the videos a bit on the shorter side. And what that means is we'll actually have more videos for this chapter, but the videos will be a bit shorter, likely a little bit easier to view then, and also will kind of break down this chapter in more manageable segments. Now, there's a lot in Chapter 7 though, so we're gonna have a few more videos here. Video 1, or I should say first, Chapter 7 is all about survey research. So video 1 is going to go over what survey research is, the types of questions researchers can ask on surveys, and response sets that participants could engage in. Video 2 will be the types of responses participants can give. Video 3 will involve how we should format the survey in a professional way. Video 4 involves how we can administer the survey. Video 5 is all about probability sampling, and video 6 is about non-probability sampling. Now, that means that we do have a few more videos for Chapter 7 than what you saw in Chapter 6. But again, my goal is that I can keep these videos a little bit more on the shorter side, maybe being anywhere between 5 to 15 minutes. And that way they're a little bit easier to view and hopefully breaks down this chapter into manageable segments. Now, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. I still included a chapter outline for Chapter 7, even though we kind of already talked about what this chapter is when we just went over these videos. But as you know, Chapter 7 is all about survey research. And so this chapter will walk us through what survey research is, the types of questions that we can ask on a survey, and the ways that participants can give responses. We'll also talk about how to format a survey so that it meets professional standards. And this is going to help us complete the first half of Lab 13 for our class. Formatting a survey, or point 4 on this outline, is actually very important for all of you for your research projects, because we will have surveys of some form, even if the surveys that we create are just to measure demographic questions like age or ethnicity or gender. We'll devise surveys, and we need to make sure those surveys are formatted professionally. It's also very important to think about how to administer the survey, or point 5 here. It's likely that now we will have to administer our surveys online. So I really want everyone to think about, when we cover point 5, I want us to think about ways that we think we can administer the survey using an online format. Now, finally, Chapter 7 concludes by talking about how we can gather data from the population with a sample. All right, now in this video, we're going to talk about survey research and types of questions. And before we really get into this, I have a question for all of you. And I know I can't see your responses, but you know, bear with me here. Survey research is one of the most popular types of research methods. So I'd like you to raise your hand, or at least think about if you have taken a survey at any point in the past. I'm willing to bet about 95 to 100% of us have taken a survey before. And I want you to think about some of the surveys that you might have taken a bit more recently. What were they for? Were they for fun? Maybe like a BuzzFeed quiz or something like that. Maybe a personality inventory. Were they for work? Were they for school? Or maybe all of those things. Now, surveys, again, are very common, and they're one of the most popular ways to collect data. We'll talk about why in a moment, but it's likely that we already have experience with surveys. So I want you, as you learn about this chapter, to really think about how you could create a really solid, rigorous, and professional survey for your projects. Now, if you're wondering what a survey is just a questionnaire or an interview that asks people to provide information about themselves. And this is key. The interesting thing about a survey is that when people complete them, they're often providing information about themselves in one way or another. They might report on attitudes that they have towards a certain item, thing, group, or anything else. They could also report on their own beliefs. Maybe they report on their demographic characteristics. These are things like ethnicity or age or gender, stuff like that. They could also predict a future behavior that they engage in, like what is the likelihood that you will complete reflection 3 for chapter 7 by Tuesday at 11:59 p.m., which, spoiler alert, is when it's due. Maybe I could ask a question of you that would ask you to predict that future behavior. You might also be asked on a survey to recall past events, like think back to a time when you last took a survey. What was it like? This recollection of past behavior or events is also a very kind of common question format. Now, all of this is to say that surveys can measure a variety of different things. They can tap into attitudes, beliefs, demographics, and so much more. And so survey research is quite broad, but it's different from what we learned about in chapter 6. In chapter 6, I want you to think about the different types of observational research that we discussed. What was one of the methods from chapter 6 that we learned about? Hopefully we can think of some, but to kind of let you know what those were. In chapter 6, we talked about observational studies like naturalistic observations, systematic observations, case studies, and archival research. Those were the 4 things that we discussed in that chapter. Now, survey research is different from all of those types of observational studies, and I want you to think about the role of the researcher. In observational studies, what does the researcher do? What is their role? Would you say it's a very active role or a passive role? Hopefully, we said it's a rather active role. The researcher's role in observational research tends to be more active, but in survey research, the researcher's role tends to be a bit more passive. Let's talk about why. With observational research, the researcher is going out there, getting into the field, and often taking notes in some way. Think about a naturalistic observation. The researcher literally puts themselves into a setting and takes notes about everything they can in that setting. In a systematic observation, the researcher decides to go to a certain setting and focus on a certain subset of behaviors, but still is taking lots of notes, processing that information, and analyzing that information to draw conclusions. Essentially, they're the ones recording the data, and their role in that recording and interpretation is very active. They're directly doing it. But think about how researchers tend to administer surveys. They come up with a list of questions, and then they give participants those questions, and then participants record all the information about themselves. Now, this means that for survey research, the researcher's role is a bit more passive. They're not directly out there creating the data through their notes or things like that. Instead, they give a survey to a participant, and then the participant records the data, and the researcher analyzes that. Now, it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing to have a more passive or active role. I just really want us to know that a big distinction between the methods we talk about in chapter 7 and the methods we talk about in chapter 6 involves the role of the researcher in these different types of designs. Now, also, let's talk about the type of data that sometimes comes out of these studies. With survey research, we could have a quantitative survey that involves kind of numbers and things like that, or questions that could be coded into numbers. Or we could also have open-ended questions that yield qualitative data. But with observational research, often this yields qualitative data in one way or another. That's not always the case. There are some observational studies that will yield quantitative data, but largely observational research will typically yield qualitative data. And many surveys yield quantitative data, though again, sometimes surveys are qualitative. Now that we've kind of talked about what survey research is and how it's different from what we learned about in chapter 6, let's talk about the types of questions that we can ask on surveys. Now, surveys can be really broad. They can ask questions about one's attitudes and beliefs by asking how people are thinking or feeling towards a particular issue. And these are common questions that we see on surveys. These questions could ask people to, for instance, reflect on themselves. We could develop a self-esteem survey to see how people view themselves overall. But maybe we're also interested in how people feel about a particular phenomenon or other person or group of people. We could ask survey questions about those attitudes and beliefs as well. Now, we can also ask survey questions about facts and demographics. These tend to be questions that ask participants to provide characteristics about themselves, like their age or their ethnicity or their gender or sexual orientation or religious background or things like that. Now, typically, these tend to be included at the beginning or the end of the survey, but I want you to think for a second. Where do you think these demographic questions should go if you had to choose? Should all of those demographic questions where participants provide information about themselves go at the beginning of the survey or at the end of the survey? Well, I know this one's a little bit tricky, but it is my personal recommendation and the recommendation of others who have taught me with, or other people who have helped me learn how to conduct research with surveys. It is recommended to put demographic questions at the end of the survey. Now, I want you to think about why. Why wouldn't you put these questions at the beginning? Well, when you give a survey to a participant, is it guaranteed that they'll answer all questions? No. Sometimes they might start answering some questions and then get a little bit bored and stop. Or maybe they don't have a lot of time and they thought they could take all of the questions on the survey, but they actually have to run and they can't finish it. Now, if that's the case and your participant kind of doesn't finish everything, do you want to get the demographic information from them, or do you want them to answer the most important questions about the most important variables on the survey? Probably the latter. You want to put your most important questions first on a survey, or you at least want to put them as close to the beginning as possible. And that's because if participants don't finish a survey, you want to make sure that you at least get their data for those most important things that you're looking at. Typically, those aren't your demographic questions. And so those demographic questions can go at the end of the survey. Another key thing here is that demographic questions can sometimes be a little bit jarring for participants or make them think about themselves in these different categories like age or gender or ethnicity or things like that. And that can kind of influence subtly how participants would answer the rest of the questions on a survey. It could also kind of ask participants to reveal a lot of information about themselves that they might not be comfortable doing at the start of the survey. It's better to build rapport through the questions on your survey by starting with the most important questions on the variables that you care about and ending with the demographic questions, so that once participants get to the end, they say, oh, demographic questions, I could do this real quick. And they're not, it's not the first thing they see and therefore like the first thing that they have to report on. It's a good way to, again, build rapport by including them at the end, and participants are much more likely to fill out those questions if they see them at the end than if they see them at the beginning. This is especially true if survey questions are asking about slightly sensitive demographic information. For instance, some sensitive demographic questions could involve things like income, right? Asking about financial status can be kind of challenging. Or also other things like sexual orientation or gender identity. These are questions that can be challenging for some people to answer, and it could also, if confidentiality or anonymity is not maintained properly, which it will be in all of our studies, but on the off chance that the participant doesn't trust the researcher with maintaining confidentiality, answering those questions can be a really scary thing. So, basically, your demographic questions should go at the end of the survey. Now, also, survey questions can ask about behaviors. This can be past behaviors, predicted future behaviors, things like that. Again, survey questions can be super broad, ask about a variety of different things. And one of the issues with them, though, is that, do you think participants are always honest when they answer these survey questions? No. Not always. And so sometimes what happens is participants, when they fill out a survey, will engage in a response set. A response set is a tendency to answer all questions from a particular perspective, even if that perspective doesn't accurately represent the participant themselves. Now, sometimes participants know that they're misrepresenting themselves. They are intentionally doing it, whereas other times participants aren't aware that they're lying. And let's talk about a couple ways that this could happen. One of the most common response sets is called social desirability. And social desirability is a tendency to answer survey questions in a way that makes one seem like they engage in behaviors that are considered desirable by society standards. Here's a classic example. Let's say you go to the dentist and the dentist says like, hey, do you brush regularly? And you're like, yeah, I do. And then they go, okay, cool. Do you use mouthwash? And you're like, yeah, sure. And then they say, do you floss? And you're like, every day, multiple times, of course, who doesn't floss? It's common that people don't floss. It's also common that we lie about it. And why do we lie about it? Because it's socially desirable to floss. And I'm not talking about flossing like the dance, to give kind of a somewhat outdated now meme reference, but I'm talking about flossing like flossing our teeth. And so a lot of people might not floss regularly, but we would like to say that we do, especially when talking with a dentist, because it makes us seem like we're engaging in more socially desirable behaviors. Now, the pressure to report that we're doing everything right, that we are engaging in these socially desirable behaviors, it's a pretty strong pressure for some of us. And so sometimes participants will engage in this social desirability response set where they tend to report that they're doing all the things right, whereas in reality, they might not be. Now, think about this though. Sometimes we might know that we're lying. Like maybe someone hasn't flossed in the last 6 months and they show up to the dentist and they say they floss every week, every day. Clearly they know they haven't, and that would be an overt lie. But sometimes participants unintentionally misrepresent themselves. They unknowingly lie. Like maybe someone flosses occasionally, maybe a few times a week, but not every day. So when they go into the dentist and the dentist says, how much do you floss on average? They might say, I floss pretty regularly. And they think they do because maybe the last few nights they did actually floss. And so it's fresh in their mind and that's what they remember. Now, it might still be an inaccurate response, but sometimes we misrepresent ourselves and we don't always remember things accurately. Social desirability can sometimes be very overt and intentional, whereas other times it could be unintentional and we don't even know we're doing it. And that's the tricky thing with surveys. We don't know when our participants are lying a lot of the time. Now, there are things that we can do to try to catch a social desirability response set, or some of the other response sets we'll talk about. We can include what's called a validity scale in our survey. And validity scales involve questions that are so strongly worded, no one would say they do that unless they were lying. And so basically an example, let's say that we are writing a survey about depression. And so we include a survey question that says, I always feel happy. Now, not everyone doesn't always feel happy. It's normal to not be happy sometimes. But if someone is engaging in a response set, they might lie and say, yeah, I feel happy all the time, because they want the researcher to think of them in a good light. Now, those validity scales have questions like that are so strongly worded, no one should be agreeing with them. And so that's one of the ways that researchers can kind of catch if someone's intentionally lying. Because if someone's saying yes to those questions that are so strongly worded, then they're probably misrepresenting themselves. And then the researchers can go through, look at their data, and decide if they should leave it in the sample or if they should delete it. All right, now let's talk about a couple more types of response sets, and then we'll wrap things up for this video. Two other common types of response sets are called yay saying and nay saying. And again, is there any creativity in how we name things in research methods? No. Yay saying and nay saying are exactly like what they sound like. With yay saying, a participant says, yes, or agrees to almost all of the questions. Naysaying is the opposite. A participant says no or disagrees to all or almost all of the questions. Now, again, often the reason behind this can sometimes be intentional. Participants might just say, you know, like, I am just going to say yes to all of this because I want to, or maybe the participant's a little angry and they're like, I'm just going to disagree and say no to everything. Sometimes that happens. But also, sometimes we have what's called a tendency toward, or sometimes we are likely to show a tendency towards acquiescence. What this means is we're more likely to say that we agree with something than disagree. And so sometimes participants might start saying yes to everything or agree to everything just because they are more likely to want to agree overall. But either way, yay-saying and nay-saying are response sets where participants are just answering all of the questions with a certain mindset, even if that mindset doesn't reflect who they are. Now, as researchers, we have to watch out for these response sets, whether it's social desirability, yay-saying, or nay-saying, because that means that if a participant is engaging in a response set, it means they're not accurately representing themselves, and that's a problem. Now, again, we can catch these with validity scales sometimes, but ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to trust that our participants are honest. And this goes back to some of those ethical things we were talking about, where researchers should do the best job that they can at developing a good rapport with participants so that if the participants trust the researchers, they're more likely to answer honestly. Now, this brings us to the end of our first video. In the next video, we will talk about the types of responses that participants can give. But until then, I'll see you all then. All right, bye.